Good day, everyone. This is lecture 8, the second lecture in the third topic. We're dealing with the medieval period and medieval philosophy. And lecture 7 gave us an account of the early medieval era. And we focused on the work of St. Augustine, a tremendous foundation for Christian theology, and also for Western philosophical thinking that he laid. Today we are going on to the other great thinkers of the medieval period. But before that, I think you need to get an insight into the historical background. One of the things that this course will certainly try to emphasize is the direct relationship between any cultural or historical phenomenon or event or social event and the historical background. And when we talk about the historical background, we are talking about developments in the society, trends in civilization. We are talking about significant political developments. That is always important because thought is never generated outside of the context of an actual historical experience. It is always a response to that experience in some way or another, no matter how otherworldly the worldview or the thinking may be. And so I will always emphasize the significance of the supervening history or the historical context within which these thought movements are generated. There are a number of interesting developments that took place after the time of Augustine, and in a way prepared the ground for the kinds of philosophical changes and reflections that thinkers were engaged in by the end of the first millennium. Right? There clearly was, there had been very significant developments in history, and I'm going to try to indicate all of these developments, or most of these developments. First of all, we did emphasize and we pointed to the collapse of the Western Empire. Right, the Western Empire collapsed under the onslaught of barbarian invasions. The Huns, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, they descended on southern Europe. The Vandals eventually went to North Africa, and the empire was devastated as a result of their military attacks and their military conquests. But what survived and what was able to become the dominant institution around which that Roman Christian civilization could rally was the church based in Rome. The church really was an ecumenical institution, and therefore the church based in Constantinople was not unrelated to that one which was based in Rome, but because of the radically different institutional framework within which they developed, the church in Rome, the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, developed along radically different lines and had to play the role of government very often. The role that government, in the absence of government, it was the church that had to play the role of government. And so the church took rise during that period. And when we studied Augustine, we saw that a book like A City of God provided the theological and the philosophical foundations for the church's ascendancy, for this very significant and central role that the church was able to play. It provided that justification. It was a kind of apologia, providing a justification for the church's assertion of its dominance and its centrality in Western European affairs. Now, by the 7th century, a very significant development took place, and very often that is forgotten. And that is the rise of Islam in Arabia. Now, nobody could have imagined that in a place like Arabia was not a center of civilization. Arabia was just a stopover point for caravans that were moving from east to west very often. Many of the Arabians were just traders. They live in desert country. Desert people are generally nomadic, and they're very good fighters. But the great civilizations around lived in river valleys. The Nile civilization in Egypt and the Tigris-Euphrates civilization, they lived in river valleys where there was a tremendous amount of wealth, massive food production, and so on. And these civilizations did have a certain kind of ascendancy in the ancient world. So it is very, very irregular for a peripheral society, a nomadic community, not as cultured and sophisticated as those living in the heart of these urbanized complexes, to rise and to become the dominant power in the world. And Muhammad himself, right, he had his religious experiences. He claimed that he had been inspired by and dictated to by the angel Gabriel. He had produced the Quran, and now the new religion was developing, an Abrahamic religion that accepted the authority of the Old Testament, that accepted a certain kind of affinity with Christianity, but saw itself as the religion that would replace Christianity, come after, and take human moral and religious consciousness to a different level. Muhammad's policies were very much unlike crisis policies. They were similar to the policies of perhaps Abraham and Moses and David. They were military leaders, right, who were conquering territories. But the difference with Islam was that Islam was conquering territories with the objective of converting people to the newfound faith. When Islam was formed, it was formed as a result of a number of influences. In Arabia itself, not only did you have traditional Arab cults that existed there, out of which Islam arose, although Islam was a new monotheistic religion, rejecting the polytheism of the various cults around. But Islam there were Jewish communities in Arabia, and there were also Christian communities in Arabia, right? Mandaean Christians, there were Jews there. Jews always lived in those areas, and they would have had an impact on the formation of early Islamic thought, early Islamic ideas, and you can see that very prevalent in the Quran itself. So Islam arose in the 7th century in Arabia, and by the 8th century, Islam had overrun much of the then known world. In fact, the empire that the Arabs had established was an empire that was greater than anything Rome or Greece or Syria or Egypt or any of the previous civilizations had been able to achieve. Islam was able to conquer all of North Africa. North Africa was the heart of Christianity. When we talked the last time, we said that Augustine was the bishop of Hippo. He died as the bishop of Hippo, a North African city, he himself being an African. And all of North Africa was solidly Christian. It is there that most of the early Christian theology took shape, right? The synthesis that took place between Judaic thought and Hellenic thought, right, that emerged as the Christian faith, was really largely a phenomenon, a cultural and intellectual phenomenon that was experienced or witnessed in North Africa. By the 8th century, Islam had conquered all of North Africa. And the conquest of North Africa eventually led to the collapse and the virtual disappearance of Christianity in North Africa. North Africa now became essentially Islamic. There were still pockets of Christianity. One of the things that Islam did not do is that Islam did not persecute Christians. They did not persecute Christians, and they did not persecute Jews. They regarded them as people of the book. But where they ruled, they created social and legal conditions that made it difficult for Christianity, for the religion to be sustained. And so people naturally converted to Islam. Again, as I said, when we were dealing with early Christianity, most people tend to worship the gods of their conquerors. the people who ruled them, the emperor, the king, the sovereign. And so all of North Africa basically became Christian. So Islam was able to conquer not only North Africa, but penetrated into Europe itself. It penetrated in this early period into Spain, and Spain largely became Islamic. It was a center of Catholicism, and there were a number of great Catholic saints, right, who essentially were Spanish. But Spain became, especially southern Spain, the more civilized, cultured, sophisticated, developed part of Spain was Islamic Spain. Toledo, Cordoba. Cordoba was one of the leading Islamic cities. And in fact, people used to, if they could afford it, take a trip to Cordoba to see what a modern city was like, with its fountains and its huge buildings and its beautiful temples and its arcades and so on. It was an actually a magnificent city. Islam was able to circumvent the Sahara. It's the first time that any Mediterranean civilization had done that. Circumvent the Sahara in places like Morocco and so on, and eventually penetrate into sub-Saharan Africa. So civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa, Negroid civilizations like Songhai, right, and Mali and so on, Ghana, these became largely Islamic. And up to the present time, Islam is a powerful force in very much of Africa, especially south of the Sahara, and later on in East Africa. Islam penetrated into the Mediterranean world, the western portion of the Asiatic continent. They were not initially able to conquer the Roman Empire, the Greek section of the Roman Empire. They never conquered Constantinople until about 1,000 years later. And but they penetrated very much of the surrounding territory. Syria, Palestine, all of these places were now controlled by Islam. Eventually Persia. Islam reached as far as India. And that is why Pakistan, northern India is still Islamic. They were not able to dislodge Hinduism from India, but they were able to encompass a lot of northern India through their conquests, right? And places like Afghanistan and so on. So Persia, Afghanistan, all of these countries became Islamic. Islam spread as far as Western China, and right now there are Islamists in Western China. They complain about persecution by the Chinese government. The Chinese are involved in a kind of re-education program to ensure that the Islamic communities would not resort to terrorism, as so many of the Western Islamic communities have been able to have resorted to. So Islam became from China to Morocco and Ghana, at no time was there in the world an empire that was that large. The only places that were not penetrated were Europe, and Europe was largely defended by the Alps. Had it not been for the massive Alps, right, the mountain range that stretches right across Europe, southern Europe, Islamic armies would have been very successful there. There are magnificent stories of the wars that took place in that medieval period, between stories like El Cid and so on. The Roma de la Rose, many of these stories are stories about European Christians, Catholics, fighting against the Islamic forces in order to halt their penetration of Northern Europe. And China was not eventually Islamized at all, but the Mongols were. The Mongolia was, and eventually the Mongols were not only able to rule China itself, but the Mongols came down into places like India and so on. There were a number of Mongolian invasions in the rest of the world. In fact, the Mongols established a massive empire, probably the largest empire the world has ever seen, stretching from China right down to Armageddon, right, in Israel. That was that was the point at which they stopped their progress west. But the Mongols eventually converted to Islam, and they Islamized. They were the ones who largely were responsible for Islamizing places like India and so on. So that is a very significant period. The capital of the world was Baghdad. Baghdad is just a few miles from Babylon. And Baghdad now, it is Islamic world that inherited very much of Greek philosophy. The great thinkers, the great mathematicians in the world were now Muslim. The great thinkers were Muslim. People like Avicenna and Averroes, Avicenna from Persia, Averroes from Spain. These were some of the leading thinkers, men who knew their Aristotle and knew their Plato, had the writings of these Greek philosophers. Europe had lost very much of that, but it was the Islamic world that had that. Islam was able to develop superb technologies. From China, they learned to make paper. I mean, their technological advancement was superb. They created new disciplines like chemistry and so on, and algebra, so that the Islamic world was the center of the world. And very often, even in our church, we are given a very distorted view of history, as if most of the important history centered around Europe. Europe was now a backwater, right? And in fact, Europeans were considered to be uncivilized, undeveloped, and very poor people living on the banks of places like the Thames in England, or the Seine, right, or the Volga, and so on. Europe was considered to be very backward. So that is another very important development that took place in the medieval period. And we're not going to be studying Islamic philosophy because our concentration is on Western philosophy. But Islam produced the greatest thinkers of that middle period. And then, very interesting, in the West, by the 8th century, a new political regime was able to emerge. And that was about the 8th century, 800 AD, when Charlemagne was able to conquer a number of territories in Germany, territories in France, and so on, in very much of Eastern Europe, and established what is called the Holy Roman Empire. One of the things that Charlemagne did, in fact, his father, I think Clovis, one of his ancestors, had initiated that. They granted lands to the Pope. That was a significant development, because now the Pope was not only the head of a church, right? And he was playing a very significant political role. He is the man who would be responsible for the coronation of these monarchs like Charlemagne and so on, Clovis. But the Pope now, with the granting of lands by the emperor, was now also a political leader. There were papal states that were established. The only surviving political territory that the Pope controls and is master of now is the Vatican City, and the Vatican City is really a small acreage of land. But the Pope was able to now become a significant political statesman with territory to rule. So he's not only the head of a church, he was the head of a regime. And to a large extent, the papacy began to develop along radically different lines than the church itself. You know, very often, again, because of our distance in history, we confuse both institutions, the Pope, the papacy, and the church. But in most of the other territories, the church remained just a religious institution, very powerful, very effective. Their leading clerics were the men who had to advise governments. They were the only thinkers, the well-educated people. They were the clerks, and so the Pope played the church played a very important part in the political and the social and the cultural life of Western Europe. But it is only in the papal states that the church, now controlled by the Pope, had territory, had political office, and therefore had to raise armies, impose taxes on people, and do what any other government does. So that was a very important development that took place. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a new phenomenon was taking place. Now, what had happened in Western Europe was that with the collapse of government, a number of people for security and safety, had to seek they had to live somewhere within the territory of great military leaders. These very often will be referred to as knights. The story of the knights, all kinds of knights, Teutonic knights and so on, the Middle Ages. Well, the knights, when government had broken down, you had to seek the protection of a knight, an armed warrior with his own private army who could provide you protection. And these became massive landowners. And so the people lived on their estates. And what developed was a system that is referred to as feudalism. The feudal society developed, strange society. Feudalism involved people having serfs. The serf is essentially a slave. They have the same derivation in Latin, same linguistic derivation in Latin. So serfdom developed, and the majority of the European population were serfs living on these massive manors, these plantations, cultivating wheat and barley and so on, and working for the various knights and members of the aristocracy. So that was a significant development that had taken place. But as people began to move around, many of them were able to get out of the plantations and go and live into the towns, into the cities. So there was a kind of urban development taking place. And by the 9th and 10th centuries, many of these territories, many of these great cities had developed universities. Now, somewhere around the 5th or 6th centuries, the Christian emperors had closed down the Greek universities. They closed down the Lyceum, they closed down the academy. As far as they were concerned, knowledge and learning was dangerous to the faith, and Europe descended into the Dark Ages. What was happening now was that the church was now the instrument to re-enlighten Europe. And therefore, these universities were established by the church. In fact, many of these large cathedrals or monasteries had schools, monastic schools or cathedral schools that you could attend. And the schools developed a very interesting curriculum, very often referred to as the seven liberal arts, right? Philosophy and theology were taught there, and philosophy was considered to be the handmaiden of theology. Theology was the central subject, philosophy was a accompanying subject, and you had a number of other things like music and astronomy and mathematics and so on. So the seven liberal arts were now what was taught in these universities, and universities became the centers of learning. And it was with the rise of these universities that we got a new outburst, a new upsurge of tremendous intellectual activity. And many of the great medieval thinkers belong to that period after the 9th and 10th centuries with the emergence of the universities. And these are the people that we're going to be talking about. Right, so that was one of the very significant developments that did take place. One thing that needs to also be taken into account is that in the 11th century, that's the beginning of the 11th century, I think it was around 1099, the ecumenical Christian church, and the Christian church was always an ecumenical church. It started as an ecumenical church in the book of Acts, and it continued as an ecumenical church. An ecumenical church is a church in which all of the various sects recognize their unity, their common unity, and they relate to each other. So when church councils are held, the Church of Alexandria can come to the council, as well as the Church of Rome, the Church of Constantinople, the Church of Antioch, the Church of Jerusalem. They all come together at the church councils. Yes, there are theological differences. Yes, there are cultural and linguistic differences here and there, right, that reflect the various cultural identities of the ethnic groups that provide membership to these churches. But the church never sees itself as split. They persecute heretics. They hardly persecute schismatics. Schismatics are always considered to be people who may have their own ideas, but they're not dangerous ideas necessarily. But heretics are people that were persecuted because they were teaching doctrines that were directly opposed to Christianity, and doctrines that were dangerous for the well-being and health of one's immortal soul. and therefore the Inquisition had been developed and so on to deal with them. But the church was an ecumenical church. What happened in the 11th century was that the church, the two major churches, because with the rise of Islam, the Church of Alexandria virtually disappeared, the Church of Antioch virtually disappeared. These were now Islamic territories, and the two churches surviving were the Latin Church in Rome and the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople. The churches split, and it's very interesting what they split over. I've given you the Latin term in the notes. They split over the inclusion of a phrase called filioque, which means in English, and the Son, in the Apostles' Creed. Apostles' Creed is a common prayer and a common statement of the church, which enunciates the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. And in the Eastern version, filioque was absent. The Western version, filioque was added. Now, filioque means and the Son. And the problem is that for the Eastern Church, the concept of the Holy Spirit is that it proceeds only from the Father, not from the Son. Both of them believe in the Trinitarian concept of God. They accept the Trinitarian concept. But the Eastern Church says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Filioque and the Son is not included in their version of the creed. The Western Church argues, no, it proceeds from the Father and from the Son. And the church split over that serious doctrinal issue because it was considered to be fundamental, right, to the faith that was proclaimed. And the Westerns regarded the Eastern version as essentially, virtually a heresy, and vice versa. So the church was split into two separate segments for the very first time, and no longer was Christianity an ecumenical movement. This situation was worsened when we come to the Reformation about 500 years later, where the church was not only split into various sects, but various warring sects where people were massacring each other, right? Believing that they were doing that in the service of God. So that is a very significant event in the history of the church, and one that needs to be taken into account. So these are some of the significant developments, historical developments that characterizes that period. And you really have to understand the development of, medieval philosophy against that very important background. Now, Aquinas is the main figure of this period. St. Thomas Aquinas, the major figure of this very important period, right? But there are some other theologians that one needs to take into account, very important people, and I will make reference to some of them. One of them is a philosopher who was quite early. In fact, he was not too long after Augustine, called Boetius. Boetius was very much of a Platonist, and he wrote a very beautiful book called The Consolation of Philosophy. Consolation of Philosophy is quite an interesting document, right? And Boetius is well known for a very long time. That remained a very central work, right, in Christian literature, and something that in a way played a kind of role of, say, the apology of Plato, providing people with a certain kind of consolation, hope, when they're facing, significant existential moments, tragic existential moments like death and illness and so on. Boetius is remembered also as a man who introduced the problem of the universals. But I will make some more references to the problem of universals later on. And then there is Anselm. Anselm was 11th century theologian. He is very often referred to as the second Augustine. He was a very voluminous writer, and he made a tremendous contribution to the development of Christian philosophy and Christian theology. Anselm was very much opposed to Tertullian's intellectual position. Tertullian was an earlier, I made reference to him before, Tertullian was an earlier theologian who had argued that there can be no reconciliation between faith and reason. You can't reconcile them. They are radically opposed, and the Christian has to choose faith over against reason. Reason is not something that you could rely on to provide you with an understanding of truth. It is really the human mind working things out for itself, and there's no certainty that the human mind reaches the right conclusions without the agency of faith, of the Holy Spirit, without of revelation from God. And so he made a very, interesting statement which has rung through the centuries as a kind of Christian irrationalism. He said, "Credo quia absurdum." That's Latin. Credo, I believe, quia, because, absurdum, it is absurd. I believe something because it is absurd. In other words, belief, I'm required to believe something when that thing makes absolutely no sense, when it's irrational. And anything that has to do with the transcendent defies reason. But I'm required to believe it, right? God's claim on me requires that I believe it, and therefore I believe it because it is absurd. That was Tertullian's position. Anselm totally rejects that position, and Anselm argues that reason must be reconciled with faith. That in fact, faith precedes reason. And his Latin phrase that was given in opposition to Tertullian's was credo. So fides quaerens intellectum, or credo ut intelligam. I've given you these terms, I've written these terms in Latin because they're used sometimes in the English accounts. The Latin phrase is retained, but the translation is, I believe in order that I may understand. Right? Fides, faith, quaerens, seeking, intellectum, reason or intellect. Faith seeks out reason. Or I believe in order that I may understand. That if I have to understand something, which is the aim of my rational faculties and my use of logic, if I have to understand something, I must first of all be committed to it through belief. I believe in order that I may understand. If I do not believe, then how on earth will I be able to understand? That was Anselm's significant contribution to medieval philosophical reflection. And he also came up with a very interesting argument, which people have been using over and over during the ages. It was not until the time of Immanuel Kant that I think the argument was completely destroyed. And that is called the ontological argument for God's existence. When Anselm enunciated the ontological argument, people were fascinated by it and didn't know how to develop a counter to it initially. Although there was a monk who opposed him, a monk called Gaunilo. Gaunilo says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And Gaunilo made a case for the fool, if the fool has to depend on the ontological argument for God's existence. And this is how the ontological argument goes. It argues that there is nothing greater in the universe than God, right? Something in understanding in which there's nothing greater can be conceived. We cannot conceive of anything greater than God. And that is basically what the first assumption of the argument is. It's a syllogism. It's an Aristotelian syllogism. If therefore we cannot conceive of anything greater than God, then we have to conceive of God as existing. Because if we conceive of God's greatness and he does not exist, then there's the possibility that an existent being can be greater than God. So in the concept of Anselm, God's being includes his existence. His essence is equal to his existence. And that's a very important phrase. essence and existence. When we come to the modern period and we're dealing with the existentialists, we'll see how the existentialists separate them out. Essence is that which you are, your identity, right? Your personality, your being, what constitutes you. And very often that has been intellectually and reflectively dissociated from the existence of the entity. All entities exist, but they differ in essence, right? We all exist as human beings, but we differ in essence, right? We have different personality traits and different histories and different memories and so on, and different undertakings and so on. So our essence is different from our existence, but what the ontological argument suggests or asserts is that in the case of God, essence and existence are one. Now, that was a very hard argument to beat intellectually, although, as I said, Gaunillo rejected it and subjected an argument for the fool. Gaunillo is also a monk. One of the interesting things we should note within the Catholic faith and within Christianity is how Catholic intellectuals, philosophers, and theologians could disagree with each other, and nobody's thrown out of the church. Right? Remember that there was the famous debate between Augustine and Pelagius, and now there's a debate between Anselm and Gaunillo. And nobody's thrown out of the church. The church may take a side eventually, and take one of the and to a large extent, many churchmen came to accept Anselm's argument. Although when we come to Aquinas, Aquinas rejected it. Aquinas couldn't see it making any sense at all, right? But the argument, right, is one that seems to be a very favorable argument, because one can not easily punch critical holes into it. And then there's William of Ockham and Duns Scotus. Duns Scotus was a Platonist, right, and a man who continued the examination and discussion of the problem of universals. And there's always that conflict between, and then there's William of Ockham. William of Ockham came up with a very interesting concept that is still used, especially in modern science and so on today. And that is, is referred to as Occam's razor. And that Occam's razor essentially is the view that the most economical argument provided is always the best argument. The one that avoids redundancies, the one that avoids repetitions and irrelevancies and so on. The simplest argument is always the best. And that has become virtually a rule in the sciences, right? When you are into the sciences and you're hypothesizing, science only pays attention to the simplest versions, not the most complicated or complex versions. Simplest versions are accepted. So Occam's razor still remains a very significant aspect of the contribution of William of Ockham. William of Ockham was an Englishman, was a British monk also. All of these men are monks. And finally, the greatest of all, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 and died in 1274. He didn't live all that long, about 50 years. But he made a tremendous contribution to the growth of Western knowledge. Right? In fact, it is by the time you get to Aquinas that people begin to talk about the medieval philosophy as essentially the philosophy of the schoolmen, scholastic philosophy with a capital S. Scholasticism is a word that is very often used to define medieval philosophy and to point to all of the issues that the medievals are dealing with. They're dealing with extremely significant issues, but very often when you look at medieval discussions and so on, there's a lot of hair splitting. There's a lot of logic chopping, right? Many of the arguments seem to be burdened by very, very circuitous and very cumbersome kinds of logical reasonings. So scholasticism, and in fact, when we come to the modern period next week, we're going to see how the moderns totally rejected the scholastic positions, right? But it is certainly by the time we get to Thomas Aquinas that people begin to talk significantly about scholastic philosophy as if philosophy that defines the medieval period. Right? Thomas was Italian, right? And he made a tremendous contribution to the growth of Christian philosophy. Just as Augustine had, in a way, legitimated Platonic thought, although Augustine wasn't too familiar with Plato himself, he was much more familiar with Plotinus, who was the man who was responsible for developing what came to be called Neoplatonism. So there's a sense in which Augustine introduced and synthesized a Platonic worldview into Christian theology. What Aquinas did was the exact opposite. Aquinas introduced Aristotle. In fact, he's very often referred to as a man who baptized Aristotle, at least baptized the thought of Aristotle. Aristotle's rigorous rationalism, his insistence on logic, his attachment to the senses as the basis to determine what is truth and what is not truth. Many of these things seem to be foreign to a Christian philosophy that insisted on the limitations of reason and the ultimacy of the transcendent and the mysteriousness of the transcendent. Plato seems to be a far more amenable philosophy, far more suitable for the Christian worldview. But now Augustine had achieved what was very, very significant, making Aristotle the opposite of Plato, the man who critiqued his master in so many ways, making his philosophy a sounder basis, philosophical basis for the Christian story, the Christian message, and the spread of the gospel. So the stress on reason is there. And Aquinas is certainly made a tremendous contribution through the utilization of Aristotelian logic and the organon, the categories, and so on. Aristotelian ideas in physics and astronomy and on the heavens and so on. He was able to use many of those arguments. And in fact, one of the reasons why Aristotle remained such a tremendous authority for so very long is largely because, you know, Aquinas, who became probably the leading doctor, and that's a position that you could say was in contention with Augustine, the leading doctor of the church today. The system of Thomas Aquinas still defines contemporary Catholic philosophy. It's called Thomism. His name is Thomas Aquinas, and his system of thought is referred to as Thomism. Catholic theology is an extremely logical theology, right? When you listen to their arguments on things like reproductive rights and so on, and the ban on contraceptives, you realize how very logical those arguments are, even though the conclusions may seem to be far-fetched, right, and unrealistic at times. The arguments are powerful arguments, extremely logical arguments. So Thomistic philosophy became the defining feature of Roman Catholic theology. It has impacted on other theologies, on Protestant theologies, but not to that extent. Aquinas's contributions were tremendous, right? He continued that old Platonic argument of knowledge through participation. Knowledge is not only the result of intellectual reflection or empirical evidence. Now, they're very often those are the strategies, those are the devices, right, or the approaches that most people adopt in arguing for the firm of a foundation for knowledge. Knowledge is based on logical argument, logical examination of the logical quality and consistency of a system of ideas, a body of knowledge, or it's based on empirical evidence and so on. But Plato had given us a notion which was supported by Aristotle to some extent, and now it's reiterated by Aquinas, and that is knowledge through participation. Now, Augustine had given us a very interesting concept, that is knowledge through illumination, right? Knowledge through illumination. Participation is even a broader term. And we know that there are certain kinds of knowledge that you can only get through participating in something like swimming or riding a bike and so on. You can't learn to ride a bike, right, without a bicycle. You can't learn to swim without getting into the water, no matter how much theoretical demonstrations are given to you. So participation is central. And the whole concept of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within the individual, right, gives you a kind of ontological base for knowledge through participation. And that became a very significant feature of the Thomistic system. And then there's the notion of analogy, very significant. In fact, the theological language is Aquinas now defines theological language as essentially analogical. It's not univocal. It's not equivocal. It's not wrong. It's not univocal. Right? You can't establish a direct relationship between the term, the word, and the object that the word represents, because you're dealing with mysteries, you're dealing with transcendent entities. And therefore, you must use analogical language. And that is why we can say God is our Father, right? And making it a true statement. But it's not like a biological father at all. There's hardly any correspondence between God and a biological father, right? But you have to use analogical language to define the realities of the transcendent world and the realities of religion. So Aquinas talks about analogical predication as essentially the language of scripture, and certainly the language of Christian theology. He talks about creation's dependence on God, right? Creation, you know, very often when you talk about God in relation to the created world, you talk about God as transcendent and external to that world. The world is there, and especially in today's world, where after Newton, we came to believe in fundamental physical laws governing the operations of natural phenomena. There's a notion that the world is there, God has created the world. That led to a rise of European deism. And he's left it there, and the world exists independent now of God. That is not what Aquinas is saying. Aquinas is saying that the world's existence relies on God. God is the ontological foundation of the world. Without God, there is no world. The world will dissolve, it will not be. And that's a very interesting notion. It could suggest that there's a hint of pantheism in it, or panentheism. Panentheism is a view expressed by Paul when he says, in him we live and move and have our being. But essentially, it is a similar notion that the whole of reality, physical reality, depends on God for its being. Right? God as himself is being itself. God is being itself. That's another very significant notion that Augustine expresses. God is in itself being, right? The totality of everything is constituted by God. It's a view that is held even by modern theologians. I may touch in the end of the course on some of the modern theologians, people like Karl Barth and Paul Tillich. Tillich's main philosophy in his systematic theologies. He has a lovely series, 3 books on systematic theology. And his argument is that God is being itself. Right? So that is a notion that comes, and Tillich is a Protestant theologian, not a Catholic theologian. But it goes right back to the Thomistic worldview. And then he believes that you can't talk about God very effectively unless you resort to the strategies or the viewpoint or the perspective of negative theology. Now, in the Middle Ages, a negative theology developed, especially in the hands of the mystics. And mysticism is a whole interesting development that took place, especially in the monasteries and so on. And a number of great Catholic saints emerged, people like St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, and so on, Jacob Boehme, and so on. These are people who had mystical experiences. And when we talk about mystical experiences, we're really talking about experiences similar to what Ellen White had, right? Where you seem to rise to, you seem to rise to other levels of consciousness, or you experience altered states of consciousness, where you could become, your surroundings. You could become oblivious of your immediate surroundings, so that you can get an insight into transcendent entities and objects, right? A lot of the mystical theology was a theology that adopted negative theology. A negative theology simply is a theology which insists that you can't see what God is, but you can see what he's not. So when you are defining theological realities, you have to use a series of negations. You can't use assertions. Nobody can say exactly what God is, but you're sure that he is not a number of other things. And Aquinas adopts that negative theology when he's talking about God. He talks about true ways of knowing God, right? Through revelation, through reason, and through intuition. And intuition would be related to participation. And then he enunciates 5 proofs for God's existence. So that's a very, very significant one, the 5 proofs of God's existence. First of all, he adopts Aristotle's major argument: God is a universal mover, or the first mover. God is the first mover of everything, right? So all the motion that we see in the world must have had some origin at a particular point in time or in eternity. And even because things can't move themselves, they have to be moved by an external force or supervening force. And that is God. He's the first mover. He's also the first cause of everything. He causes everything. He brings everything into being, right? He is also, the third argument, a source of all necessity, right? A number of things are necessary in the world. A number of things are contingent. Very often the word necessary and contingent are used as opposites. Now, most of our experiences are experiences that could be defined as contingent experiences. I'm walking down the road and I stump my toe. I meet a friend as I leave my gate who I didn't expect to meet. These are contingent things, they're not necessary things. But a number of other experiences are necessary. The fact that I have to eat to live, and so on. They are necessary, right? My relationship to God is one that makes God necessary for my survival and my existence. So he is the source of all that is necessary. The fourth argument is that he's the source of all perfections. All perfections. There is something like perfection in the universe. At least that is what Christians have always believed. And God is the source of all perfection, because perfection is not a human undertaking or a human accomplishment or project. We are human beings cannot achieve perfection on our own. Perfection has to be the finishing work of God, probably in our lives or in the universe that he has created. And God is also the basis, right, of purpose in things. That's the argument from teleology. Remember, Aristotle had given us the 4 causes, and the telos or teleology was one of the causes. The end, the telos is the end. The things are determined not only by their causes and origins and beginnings, but also by the end to which they move, right? So if things are moving in a particular direction to change, then there is a very important factor responsible for that, and that's the ultimate end. You're growing, you're young people growing, but you eventually become old people at some time, right? So old age is an end in itself, right? One would hope that old age would bring wisdom and so on, and there'd be a certain kind of perfection in achieving that. That is what is teleological, and that is provided as the main argument, one of the main arguments, the fifth argument for God's existence. So clearly, these medieval philosophers made a tremendous contribution to the growth of knowledge, right? They played a very important part in what came to be called, there was an early Renaissance, just around the time of Aquinas himself. It's not the Renaissance period, but an early Renaissance, a sort of birth, an enlightened period within the medieval world. Just around the times, as I said, when the universities were emerging. very enlightened period. And these medieval thinkers, people began to feel that there was really a new awakening, people making a tremendous contribution. Wars had decreased to some extent. The Western Church was still very much in power. The Holy Roman Empire had taken shape. The Reformation was not yet, because the Reformation returned Europe to a state of war, continuous war. But Aquinas now became, as it were, the acme, the apex, right, of that whole intellectual awakening, renaissance, rebirth, and development. And that was very significant. And clearly, what these medieval thinkers were doing was laying the foundations for the birth of modernity. The next topic that I come to is going to be the birth of the modern world. But the modern world didn't just arise out of nothing. It was not an ex nihilo creation. It was a creation that was put in place by the amazing intellectual and philosophical contributions of the medieval thinkers.